provided by Thomas Allgaier and Frennis, based on the most relevant LinkedIn posts about autonomous and mobility markets in calendar weeks 29 and 30. Frennis supports Tier 1 automotive suppliers with early-stage market validation for their R&D efforts by combining secondary research, direct OEM expert interviews, and facilitated customer meetings. You can find more info in the description. So today's deep dive is exploring, two massive tectonic shifts in mobility. First, how cities are fundamentally rethinking the physical space of their streets. And second, how capital, technology, and regulation are, they're basically sprinting to catch up with autonomy, electrification, and micromobility.
Yeah, exactly. And just to give you a quick roadmap of where we're heading today, we're going to unpack how micromobility operators are finally proving out real business models, why robotaxi companies are kind of outrunning the rules built to govern them, and why the EV transition is starting to look less like a forecast, more like a hard fact.
Right. So let's start with this first theme, the battle for physical space. Because for decades, the default was building cities for cars, but the data is really forcing a hard pivot.
It definitely is. And Hassan Majro shared this great example focusing on Pontevedra in Spain. They actually restricted car access to their historic center over 2 decades ago. And the mayor there, Miguel Angso Fernandez Lourdes, he had this really striking quote. He said, "It's not my duty as mayor to make sure you have a parking spot. It's the same as if you bought a cow or a fridge and then asked me where you're going to put them."
That is such a radical mindset shift, right? Comparing your car to a cow. But the results speak for themselves.
Oh, absolutely. The population and the property values actually grew, which is totally contrary to what critics usually fear when you restrict cars.
Yeah, and on the flip side, Hillary Orr shared a very different, highly tactical approach from Alexandria, Virginia. So they aren't banning cars outright. They're actively managing the curb using INRX data. They just recently added nearly 40 spaces in Old Town and 100 on Eisenhower Avenue.
Which is a huge contrast to what Chris Wade noted about Peterborough over in the UK.
Yeah.
They are actually trialing free evening parking backed by nearly £900,000 from the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority just to try and boost the town center.
Right, which makes you ask, are cities treating parking as just some operational afterthought? Because John Pinkard argues that it's actually the primary driver of placemaking and travel behavior.
Well, and it has massive safety consequences, too. Rebecca Sanders brought up some recent NYT coverage on how taller, boxier vehicles they're drastically increasing pedestrian risk. She's saying this requires NHTSA action and a true safe system approach, reducing exposure, severity, and the likelihood of crashes.
Which connects perfectly to Musa Yusuf's point on crossing alignment. Misaligned curb ramps and refuge islands, they literally force wheelchair users and the visually impaired into making these really dangerous corrections right in the middle of traffic.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. And speaking of danger, Khaled Chowdhury noted that Toronto's TTC is now piloting streetcar cameras because, at this, 141 people were hit while boarding or exiting streetcars over the last decade.
Oh, wow. 141.
Yeah, it's wild.
That is insane. But, while cities are moving at a glacial pace to redesign streets for safety, a whole new class of lightweight vehicles has successfully just hacked the existing infrastructure.
Right. Let's get into micromobility because the narrative here has shifted so much. It went from chaotic VC-funded sidewalk clutter to becoming this highly profitable integrated transit layer.
The financial milestone here is staggering. Marcin Matzarag broke down Lime's NASDAQ debut. So Lime debuted at a $1.66 billion valuation.
$1 billion? Wait, really?
Yeah, $1.66 billion. The revenue jumped from $521 million in 2023 to $886.7 million last year. And Uber played this beautifully. They took a minority stake and act as a distribution layer, so they route 14% of Lime's turnover without even owning the fleet.
That is so smart.
It is, and it brings up Brendan Wallace's insight. He says Lime isn't a scooter company, it's a real estate company.
Oh, like cell towers.
Exactly. Just like cell towers were telecom infrastructure that became real estate, Lime essentially monetized turb access and charging permits.
That makes a lot of sense. And they aren't the only ones winning. Graben Joel Jones reported that Bolt turned profitable in 2025. They swung to a 19.5 million euro operating profit on 2.27 billion in revenue, which was driven by a 63.4% gross margin.
A 63% margin on hardware is it's incredible. And hey, by the way, if you want to make sure you catch all our future deep dives into these market shifts, make sure you hit subscribe on whatever app you're using right now.
Definitely do that. But looking at the hardware itself, it's actually changing to match public reception. Bojan Djukic observed that e-bikes are basically defeating e-scooters. Brussels is retiring e-scooter permits by 2027.
Wait, entirely.
Yeah, entirely. And Paris, Voy, Dot, and Lime, they are all shifting their tenders toward e-bikes. Scooters kind of lost the perception war back in 2018, whereas bikes have, a century of public goodwill behind them.
That's true. But operators are getting so much better at managing the scooters that are out there. Manuel Herzog shared this great operational success story about Dot's Swiss scooter fleet. They set ridership records in Basel, Zurich, and St. Gallen during a massive heat wave and a festival weekend.
How do they avoid the usual chaos, though?
Pure operational maturity. They utilize dynamic, geofenced parking zones, and this is my favorite part, an actual don't drink and ride dexterity test right in the app.
Oh, that is brilliant. But, while micromobility figured out how to share the road, the next wave robotaxis is currently locked in a really fierce battle over how they fit into the transit ecosystem.
Yeah, the expansion there is rapid, and it is messy.
Super messy. Eduardo Rojas mapped out the global chessboard for this, and the market is essentially split into blocks. The U.S. is led by Waymo and domestic rivals. China is led by WeRide, Baidu Apollo, and Pony.ai.
And Europe is trying to position itself as this open testbed, right?
Right. But Janny Stavesand gave a pretty blunt reality check on that. The UN adopted a new Level 4 robotaxi framework globally, but the European press celebrating it is kind of missing the point. Waymo and Baidu are building an actual operational lead on the ground while Europe is, writing the rules.
Yeah, and the U.S. is having a brutal regulatory turf war over it. Daniel Abreu Marquez broke down this proposed Washington, D.C. bill, which is backed by Waymo, by the way, and it would charge robotaxi operators a $1 million fee just to apply.
$1 million just to apply?
Yep, plus a $5 million non-refundable permit fee, a $5 million liability insurance requirement, and a 15-cent per mile tax.
Wow, Uber must have lost their minds over that.
Oh, they cried monopoly immediately.
Oh.
Yet Uber's own lobbyist in New Jersey proposed a rule requiring human drivers to serve 85% of rides, which effectively forces AVs onto Uber's platform anyway.
It's all just platform politics at this point.
Exactly. The tech isn't the hardest part anymore, it's the market fight.
Right. And then there are the infrastructure and safety clashes happening right now on the street. Awad Abdelhamim and Russell King pointed out this massive road funding gap. If self-driving vehicles pay no gas tax or road charge, widespread use could raise vehicle miles by 40% while cutting transit use by 10%.
That's a scary metric. And Ben Hubbard noted the physical friction, too. Waymos are frequently blocking bike lanes during pickups, which forces cyclists out into high-speed traffic.
Which really makes you wonder, when passenger convenience and public safety collide, who wins? Are we holding AI to a higher standard than human drivers?
Well, Europe is viewing this entirely differently. Nicholas Cope pointed out that Europe doesn't just want to replace human taxi drivers with robots. They actually want fewer empty kilometers and stronger public transport overall.
Right, which is why Jan Gramatica argues that depot operations for autonomous buses are actually the most practical starting point.
Yeah. And Bas van den Heuvel summed this up nicely after a Geneva Mobility Congress. The real tension isn't the vehicle tech itself, it's ecosystem orchestration. Like, how do you balance passenger safety using remote operators and onboard cameras with the risk of creating this massive AI surveillance state?
That is a tricky balance. But, whether it's a micromobility scooter, a human-driven ride-hail, or an autonomous robotaxi, the underlying platform for all of them is electric. And the EV data is finally silencing the skeptics.
Oh, absolutely. We're crossing the threshold from early adoption to market dominance. The June 2026 milestones were huge. Stig Schroeder and Kaya Kinkel showed that electric vehicles became the single strongest drivetrain in Germany at over 28% market share. Battery electric registrations were up nearly 50% year over year in the first half alone.
And David Swan had similar data from Australia. EV sales reached nearly 1 in 4 in June. And crucially, the whole fear of battery degradation is basically being disproven. Geotab telematics data shows newer EVs lose only about 1.8% of capacity a year.
Yeah, they outlast the chassis at this point. But the manufacturing reality of this shift is still really painful. Christine Mengelet posted about Volkswagen. If you recall, back in 2019, there was a prediction that automakers without a sub-20,000 euro EV would fail by 2025.
Right.
So VW responded with the ID.2 All at roughly 25k euros, and they built a new gigafactory in Salzgitter. But the late transition still triggered like 100,000 German job cuts.
It's brutal, though Helmut Rühl from AMAG did defend VW on this, pointing out that 6 of the 10 best-selling BEVs in Switzerland last year were actually from the VW group.
Right. But there is also a hidden digital cost to these new vehicles. Donnie Sarasagara shared his experience test driving the X-Pen P7 Plus Dia. So a new EU law mandates driver distraction detection cameras in every new car sold since July 2026.
Okay, that makes sense for safety.
Sure, but while the data sleeps on a server in Europe, the system's maintenance and support are run out of Guangzhou. It raises massive questions about where GDPR protections actually end when remote engineers have access.
Yeah, that is a massive privacy loophole.
Yeah, it really is. Now, before we wrap up today, I want to leave you with a final thought on all this mobility innovation, building on a specific data point. Dennis Gordeman analyzed Belgium's federal mobility budget, which is given to employees for transit.
Right.
3 in 4 holders put the funds toward housing or rent. In fact, half spend the entire allowance on housing with 0 going to transport.
Wait, really? Nothing on transit?
Nothing. So my question is, if the ultimate mobility solution for employees is simply using their transit budget to afford housing closer to where they work, are we over-engineering our vehicles? Like, is the most disruptive next-gen vehicle actually just smarter urban housing and zoning?
That is such a wild thought.
Yeah.
Definitely something to mull over. If you enjoyed this episode, new episodes drop every 2 weeks. Also check out our other editions on charging and battery tech, commercial fleets, and SDV and AI defined. Thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to subscribe.